Bakugo sat in front of his mirror, trying to get his black tie to the right length. His mind wandered back to growing up, and the images of a bright-eyed Izuku came to his mind. He remembered running and playing pretend heroes. Izuku had always been by his side, idolizing him and his abilities. Bakugo gritted his teeth as he remembered the day that Izuku had told him that he was quirkless. He had looked to Bakugo with a determined expression and told him that even though he didn't have a quirk, he would still be a hero. Bakugo remembered when he was 8 and attending the funeral of his dad's brother. He had been quirkless and he had been killed in a villain attack. He remembered the sadness and pain his dad had gone through with the loss of his brother. Bakugo remembered the first time he had really felt panic was when Izuku said that he would be a hero. His only thoughts were, how could you do that to me? If a quirkless kid like you tries to become a hero, you're going to die and leave me alone. Everyone else always feared Bakugo, to some degree because of his natural volatile nature that he had inherited from his mother and his quirk. It made it hard for Bakugo to make actual friends at school. He always felt alone to some degree, but Izuku wasn't like that. He had always accepted Bakugo, despite his prickly nature. He had made a brash decision then and there as a kid to dissuade Izuku from becoming a hero. A tear slowly trickled its way down Bakugo's cheek. Aggravated, he ripped off the tie and threw it away with a small explosion. He looked at himself in the mirror. Why? Why? He shouted before punching the mirror. It shattered, leaving a fractured image of himself reflected back. You weren't supposed to die, you stupid Deku. I treated you like shit so you wouldn't die. He sat on his bed for a moment, his face in his hands. I'm sorry, Izuku. It wasn't supposed to end this way. Bakugo's door creaked open as Mitsuki entered. She sat on the bed next to Bakugo and rubbed his back as he began to silently sob. I know it must be hard to lose your friend like this, but you can't blame yourself, Mitsuki said. Bakugo sat up and knocked Mitsuki's hand away. What do you know? I was there before all this happened. I could have saved that idiot. He roared, tears streaming down his face. He lowered his head in shame. I was bullying him the whole time, he whispered. Mitsuki's eyes widened in horror. He always had aspirations of being a hero, even though he was quirkless. I didn't want him to get hurt, so I bullied him to try and make him give up on his dream. I encouraged everyone to be cruel to him. I was the one doing most of it. I never stood up to anyone hurting him. I enjoyed hurting my only friend. He yelled, tears now streaming down his face. Mitsuki's hand covered her mouth in shock. She stood up and made her way to the door. She avoided eye contact with Bakugo. Hurry up. Get ready. We need to leave in 10 minutes. An uncomfortable silence filled the car during the drive to the Midoriya family cemetery. Mitsuki had ceased to speak to Bakugo, or offer any words of comfort throughout the drive. Masaru had looked between his wife and his son with concern. They had fought like cats and dogs all the time, but the silence between them now left him feeling worried. When they arrived, Bakugo was surprised to see the number of cars that had come to the funeral. His surprise turned to rage when he saw a large number of classmates that had harassed Izuku mercilessly when he was alive. He was about to go over and chew his classmates out when a wave of realization and guilt washed over him. He was no different than the rest of them. He clenched his fist in frustration as he realized his hypocrisy. Turning away, he shuffled through the tombstones, doing his best to prolong having to confront Inko. He felt as if his guilt would crush him if he went to her now. As he walked, he felt someone's eyes on him. Looking up, he scanned his surroundings. He couldn't see any of his classmates or funeral goers looking in his direction. As he looked at the tree line that met the cemetery, he saw someone walking through the trees. They seemed like they were dressed for the funeral, but also avoiding it. He then thought he saw a familiar mop of green hair. "Izuku?" he whispered hopefully. Bakugo shook his head. That was stupid, he thought. Izuku's dead. It must be his dad, Hisashi. Figures that the only time the deadbeat shows himself is at his son's funeral, he muttered. He began to follow Hisashi into the trees. He watched Hisashi stay a consistent distance ahead of him. "Hey, deadbeat!" called Bakugo angrily. He increased his speed to catch up to Hisashi. The man paused for a split second before continuing onward. He didn't seem to walk faster, but somehow he still managed to stay the same distance from Bakugo. He made his way effortlessly through the trees and undergrowth. Bakugo began panting as he tried to catch up. "Hey! Stop!" he yelled, feeling the branches of the trees snagging his suit jacket. "Damn it!" he shouted as he felt his foot catch on a root. He fell to his hands and knees. His hands began letting off small popping sounds, igniting some of the dry underbrush, as he felt anger begin to boil over. He quickly slapped the embers out before standing back up. He scanned the tree line ahead of him. Hisashi was nowhere to be seen. "Fuck!" he yelled, letting out a loud explosion from his hands. He took a deep breath to calm himself down before trudging forward in the direction he had last seen Hisashi walking. He stumbled and pushed his way through the underbrush until he happened into a clearing. The clearing was populated with old tombstones. Moss and vines covered them, making them appear even older. It was somewhat sad to see. Someone that people used to care about was buried out here, now forgotten and being consumed with no one to remember them. His mind wandered back to Izuku in the night he died. The cemetery reminded him of the dead look in Izuku's eyes. The snapping of a branch broke him out of his thought process. Looking up, he saw Hisashi, standing in front of one of the graves with his back to him. "What are you doing here?" Bakugo asked angrily. "You don't care enough about him to show up when he was alive? You really think that showing up now makes up for it?" Hisashi sat there silent. "Well, say something!" snapped Bakugo.
Where were you?
A deep voice resonated. Bakugo felt his heart begin to race, and a faint ringing sound began to fill his ears.
When he called out for help, what were you doing?
Bakugo blinked and Hisashi was gone. Bakugo found himself in an alleyway. He felt his heart beating in his ears. What's going on? He tried to move, but he felt as though his feet were stuck to the ground, as if something was holding on to his ankles and holding him down. Looking down, he saw the pavement beneath his feet. His breath caught in his throat as a dark red liquid began to slowly pool around his shoes. "I called out to you. I always thought you would be a hero," said Izuku. Bakugo slowly turned his head to look back from where the voice came from. He saw Izuku, sitting in a pool of blood. His body looked as though it had been abandoned there and rotting for a while. Moss and vines were growing through and around his body, just like the tombstones. Bakugo began breathing faster as fear began to course through him. He stared in terror at the blank, milky white eyes of Izuku. "I'm sorry," Bakugo whispered. He felt his heart skip a beat as Izuku's white, milky eyes turned to look at him. Izuku's body cracked and popped as it began to sit up. "Bakugo," Izuku said. Bakugo tried to move but felt himself paralyzed with fear. "Bakugo," the corpse of Izuku said again, standing up. A long spike that looked to be similar to a quill slid out of Izuku's stomach, falling to the ground, making a wet splat in the blood. Bakugo began to panic, struggling against the paralysis. Izuku took a step forward.
Bakugo.
Izuku reached out his hand, placing it on Bakugo's shoulder.
Bakugo?
Bakugo screamed, feeling the paralysis disappear.
Bakugo.
He jumped away, feeling the hand on his shoulder slip away.
Dude, are you okay?
Tsubasa said, pulling his hand back. Bakugo looked around, still shaking. The little cemetery was there, but the tombstones stood clean. There was no undergrowth to be seen.
I'm fine.
He said, his voice still shaking.
Cool. The ceremony's about to start. I figured you'd like to know.
Tsubasa said. He began inching away from Bakugo, preparing for the explosive teen's usual outburst. Looking around one more time, Bakugo took a deep breath before pushing past Tsubasa.
Let's go. It'd be rude to be late. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to mourn the passing of Izuku Midoriya, who was taken from us far too soon. Young Midoriya was a bright star that sought to elevate all those around him. He desired to uphold justice and protect all those
Bakugo listened to the priest,
could
who
not
spoke
protect
over Izuku's
themselves.
grave.
He
This
sought
guy
as
doesn't know
many
anything
do
about
to be
Izuku, he thought to himself.
True, you deserved better, Izuku.
Bakugo tried to resist the pressure building up in his throat. His tears began to well up and roll down his cheeks. The air around Bakugo seemed to chill.
Young Midoriya, who found himself murdered because those he believed in were unworthy. Heroes and friends alike have turned their backs to the suffering of the weak, instead of lifting up the weak to make them stronger.
Bakugo's head shot up as he heard the distorted voice of the pastor
The
speak.
ones you are meant
What? Looking around, Bakugo saw that everyone seemed not to notice the pastor's words. Someone moved to walk towards Izuku's grave. The curled mop of green hair he had been seen before walking through the forest, but something seemed off. He was too short to be Hisashi. Bakugo felt a chill run up his spine as he felt his palms begin to sweat in his clenched fists. The faint, sweet smell of glycerin reached his nose. The man walked around the grave until his front was facing Bakugo. Bakugo's mouth fell open and he felt his heart begin to beat faster as he saw Izuku standing over his own grave. Izuku looked up, revealing the same dead, milky white eyes that he had seen in his vision in the forest. Bakugo felt his breath involuntarily quicken as his heart raced. He felt his mind begin racing. What is happening? Why am I seeing this? This can't be real. He began to feel lightheaded and forced his eyes closed. He took a deep breath to try and calm himself. Opening his eyes, Bakugo looked around. Izuku was gone, and he felt this sense of relief wash over him. That relief vanished when he realized that everybody was looking at him. His body once again felt as though he was paralyzed. The eyes of everyone present had the same dead, milky white look that Izuku's had. That was when he heard it. The sound of bone cracking. The movement of something moving behind him. Bakugo struggled to breathe. He felt tears stream down his face as terror began to rise in his chest. How dare you cry here? You care about me now? What, that I'm gone? Izuku asked, whispering into Bakugo's ear. You were the reason that I suffered all these years. It was always you who instigated my pain. Turned people against me. People made sure that I was always alone. You don't have the right to cry here. Bakugo felt a hand on his shoulders, and he attempted to cry out in fear, but found himself still stuck, stationary, and unable to make a sound. See, this is what it feels like when you die. Stuck in your body, unable to move or scream out for help. You might ask yourself, then, how are you here? Why aren't you trapped in your body? Izuku stepped in front of Bakugo, causing him to moan in fear through clenched teeth. His emerald green eyes glowed like flames as his cheeks tore up his face, creating an unnatural grin. Tears ran freely down Bakugo's cheeks as he managed to get out a small whisper.
Why?
Izuku's expression fell. He cocked his head to the side curiously. Why? He pondered. Because people like you and our classmates won't learn if no one punishes you for doing wrong. Because heroes like Overgear will continue to kill people like me if they aren't punished. Bakugo felt a jolt of confusion as Izuku mentioned Overgear killing him. He was killed by a villain in an alley, not a hero. This isn't Izuku, he thought.
You've not Izuku.
Bakugo said through gritted teeth. The grin formed on Izuku's face again at Bakugo's statement. He leaned in, whispering into Bakugo's ear. You're right. I'm not Izuku. Not anymore. Now I'm just Deku. And I'm coming for all of you. Izuku skipped through the ever-present fog that surrounded him as he walked away from his funeral. He had managed to feed on a couple of people today, allowing him to feel a sense of fullness that he had not felt before he died. He was especially satisfied with the feast he had gotten off of Bakugo. The fear and terror painted on his former bully's face gave him more satisfaction than he had expected. Izuku stopped smiling and adopted a more serious expression as he turned around to face the 10-foot-tall creature slowly following behind him. Izuku bowed to Alp. Thank you for helping me with this. I don't think I would have been able to achieve the desired results on my own. Alp let out a soft chuckle.
There is no need to prostrate yourself to me. You are still far too young to interact physically or toy with the minds of your prey yet. But your ingenuity in creating this scenario gives me very high hopes for your future.
They walked in silence for a time back towards the city. The deep moans of shadow creatures in the distant mist made Izuku glad that they were still walking together. Alp, can I ask another favor? Izuku asked tentatively.
What is it?
Izuku took a deep breath before responding. I want to go after the villain that killed me. In order to do that, I need more information on him. Can you help me get into the police station and help me get access to the files so I can track him down? Alp stroked his skeletal jaw while he thought.
Your methods of finding prey intrigues me. As you wish, I will help.
He gestured to the city below them.
Where shall we begin?
Izuku and Alp wandered the city for a few hours trying to find a police station. Izuku personally had never needed to go to a police station, and because of that was uncertain where they would find one. By some act of God's kindness, Izuku and Alp stumbled onto a villain attack. They watched as a couple of small-time villains robbed an ATM. They watched patiently as a villain with a strength quirk began tearing at an ATM, spilling cash everywhere. The other villain, a thin man with knives for fingertips, began cursing out the larger man for losing cash. Suddenly there was a crash as a hulking mass fell from the sky, kicking up clouds of dust. As the dust cleared, Izuku felt his hands ball into fists, as his teeth began grinding involuntarily.
Fear not, citizens, for I am here.
The powerful figure of All Might stood as the dust settled.
Surrender, you vile villains. This money belongs to the bank, and the ones who worked for it with sweat on their brow.
He yelled. With a quick jump, he leapt forward before the villain with the knife fingers could react and punched him in the gut, dropping him instantly.
Now is the time for you to put that ATM down and surrender.
All Might repeated. The big guy looked at his fallen companion at the street around him before turning back to All Might.
I hear you're weaker now. I think there's a good chance I can take you.
All Might froze for a moment, stunned by the villain's statement before brushing it off.
I think you'll find that statement to be very wrong.
Cracking his knuckles, All Might readied up in a typical boxing stance.
Well, I'm going to prison either way.
The big guy said, cracking his neck.
Let's do this.
He charged forward, cocking his fist back to punch All Might. All Might lunged forward to match his opponent, and just as he began to throw his fist forward, he panicked as a young green-haired boy he recognized was suddenly in front of him. All Might stopped his punch just before hitting the green-haired boy, only to feel a fist collide with his jaw.
What?
Blinking, All Might threw his arms up in a defensive position. It hadn't really hurt, it had just taken him by surprise. Glancing around, he looked for the green-haired boy. He intercepted and blocked the barrage of fists as he scanned the surroundings. The sight of the boy had filled him with shock and some regret. He had had an offhand discussion with Takachi Yamato from the Bureau of Superhero Affairs about the quirkless boy who had stepped in to help during the sludge villain incident. He had no idea that Yamato would out and slander the boy's heroic efforts. He had looked back on the incident later that week and realized that the boy had been brave and, quite frankly, a true hero. He even considered the possibility of him being a successor, if he ever had the opportunity to talk with him and apologize. He never thought that he would see him today of all times.
Enough of this game, villain!
All Might shouted before jumping back just out of the villain's reach. He pulled back and jumped forward, creating a burst of air pressure that knocked the villain into the wall and unconscious. Dusting himself off, All Might looked around at the crowd of people that gathered. He scanned the crowd looking for the green-haired boy, but just as quickly as he showed up in the fight, he had vanished as if he weren't there. All Might grabbed the villains and tied their hands with zip-tie cuffs before being swarmed by fans wanting autographs and photos. It was another 3 minutes before the police arrived. Izuku and Alp watched from their perch on a nearby rooftop, as All Might talked with the crowd and took photos with his fans.
Why did you show yourself to that man like that?
Asked Alp, confused.
Has he hurt you in some way?
He asked inquisitively. Izuku sighed, beating himself up for acting irrationally. He was my favorite hero. I met him once, a month before I met you. He told me my dream of being a hero was useless and that I couldn't be a hero without a quirk. Izuku grimaced at having to relive the painful memories again. He then got mad at me for endangering myself and others because I tried to help the blonde boy we just visited. If Alp had had eyebrows, they would have shot up. He whipped his head around to stare at Izuku.
The boy we just fed on. From what you told me about yourself growing up amongst the humans, the boy was the worst to you. Why would you save him?
Izuku watched in silence as the police car pulled up on the street below, contemplating his next answer. I did it because it was the right thing to do, he said sarcastically. If I had known how this was going to turn out for me, I don't know if I would have done it, he said, guilt and shame clawing at his insides for thinking in such a way. Alp watched Izuku, seeing the internal struggle happening within him.
These feelings do not serve you now,
He said, placing large, spindly fingers on Izuku's shoulders.
They abandoned you, betrayed you, left you to die.
He cooed into Izuku's ear.
You are something more. You will grow into something far stronger than any of them can comprehend. Soon, they won't be your enemies. Just food.
Sighing, Izuku shook his head. He would need to put these thoughts on a shelf and focus on the task at hand. Okay, let's get down there. We don't want to miss our ride. Izuku and Alp made their way down the wall as the officers began putting the villains into the back of squad cars. As Izuku reached the ground, he saw another car pull up and a familiar face exit. Detective Sakauchi walked across the scene to where All Might was standing. So, you're still pushing your time? Sakauchi asked, tapping All Might on the shoulder. All Might turned to see the detective, his signature grin growing wider.
My friend, the workday of a hero is never over.
All Might said, boisterous. He waved Sakauchi to step a little further from the crowd.
Do you mind talking in private?
Sure, Sakauchi said, following All Might next to an alley.
So I think I spotted the kid that I was looking at as a potential successor.
All Might said conspiratorially.
It was the green-haired boy that I had told you about during the sludge filling incident.
Sakauchi's face furrowed in confusion.
The Bakugo kid?
The one with the explosion quirk.
What? No. While the explosion boy certainly has great potential to be a top hero, I'm referring to the other one, the quirkless boy, green hair.
All Might said, creating gestures of Izuku's proportions in the air. He's dead, Sakauchi said, his face darkening. He was killed a few weeks ago by a villain. His funeral was today, if I'm not mistaken. The statement shocked the smile off of All Might's face.
How, Masa? Are you sure? I just saw him with the scuffle of those villains.
Sakauchi shook his head. Sadly, yes. I was the detective on site. I saw his body and arrested the hero who was responsible for his death.
Hero responsible?
All Might said through gritted teeth.
Can we talk about this at your office? I want to know everything.
Izuku watched Detective Sakauchi and All Might disappear into the alleyway as the squad car pulled away, his dark taloned hands fusing him to the roof and preventing him from falling off. He paid attention to the street signs, devoting the pathway to memory in case he needed to find his way back to the police station again. They eventually came to a stop outside the Mizurufu Central Police Station. Alp and Izuku dismounted the car and slipped into the building as the two villains were being escorted in. The building wasn't massive. Just a 2-story brick building which Izuku found somewhat disappointing. He began to pick his way through the building, looking for any desks or plaques that had the good detective's name on it. Izuku was beginning to think that he was in the wrong building when Alp gestured him from across the floor.
You are looking for.
Perfect, he muttered, relieved to not have to scour the city for another police station. He quickly made his way to where Alp was patiently waiting. He gestured to an office, tucked away near the back of a long corridor. They quickly crossed the office and Alp opened the door, allowing the two of them to slip inside.
What is it exactly that we are looking for?
Asked Alp, gesturing around the surprisingly clean room. So we're looking for a file, although I bet it's on his computer, Izuku said, as he sat in front of the keyboard. Can you press the button? He made gestures to the keyboard, and Alp reached out spindly fingers forward, pressing the keys. The monitor sprang to life, revealing the police station's seal with a password scrawled across the screen. Izuku groaned, putting his face in his hands. He hadn't thought about this. Of course, the computers would have a password to access it. He leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Detective Sakauchi, what do you like? He breathed deeply through pursed lips as he tried to think about what a password could be. Glancing around the office, his eyes fell on the drawers of a desk. Can you open this for me?
Of course. What is it you hope to find?
Anything that would indicate the detective's password would be. Would you also look into the filing cabinet over there and see if there are any papers with my name on it? He gestured to the tall silver filing cabinet next to the wall. Alp opened the drawer and made his way to the cabinet, rifling through the papers and files. Izuku looked into the drawer and found a number of things that surprised him. A pair of handcuffs, paper clips, pens, and post-its in which didn't seem out of the ordinary. He then spied a photograph of Detective Sakauchi and All Might sitting together with some other heroes drinking. There's no way, he thought. Instinctively, he tried to type on the keyboard, growling in frustration as the keys refused to move under the weight of his fingertips. Alp, can you type All Might into the computer? Alp sat, looking at a folded piece of paper before looking up.
I suppose I may have found something useful to you.
He said, crossing to where Izuku sat, paper in hand. Alp fumbled with the keyboard, his unusual shaped fingers struggling to hit the right keys. The screen switched to one of All Might as the main page booted up. Izuku shook his head and grinned. I didn't think that'd actually work. Okay, click on that file, he said, gesturing to the file on the screen that said Open Cases. Alp clicked it and began cycling through the folder until they stopped on one that said Midoriya Izuku. Izuku began scanning the file until he saw a link that referred to a file of villains possibly linked to his murder. Opening the file, Izuku flipped through the different villains' dossiers until he stopped on one with a porcupine-looking villain. Izuku instantly recognized the photo, and a smile touched the corner of his lips. Found you, he muttered to himself. The file refers to a map of possible locations of villains' whereabouts. Izuku turned his head at the sound of fluttering paper behind him.
I present to you my findings.
Alp said, grinning. Alp laid a map out on the floor and he began studying it. Different colored circles blotted parts of the map, and the names associated with the corresponding colors lay notated in the margins. Izuku noted that the villain that had attacked him went by the name of Quill, a name which he felt was a little too on the nose. He saw that the name was linked to the red circles on the map. Izuku began tracing lines from one circle to another with his finger, and he noticed that a number of the lines intersected at their midpoints, around the industrial district of the map. So there's a social theory about crime, Izuku said, motioning to the map. So when an animal hunts, it often hunts with an important place as its starting point. In this case, it's home. If the animal's non-migratory, then the points where it attacks will inevitably make a circle around the center. The center of that circle is generally the area of the animal's home, Izuku said, locking eyes with Alp. He grinned and gestured at the industrial area of the map. I'm willing to bet that Mr. Quill's home is somewhere here.
I see. So you will begin your search in this area. This hunt will be your own. I shall not help you this time.
Alp stared at Izuku, letting the weight of what he had just said sink in.
And what of the boy's mother?
They both turned as the sound of voices came from the other side of the door. Look, I assure you that we're doing everything we can to aid Miss Midoriya. Like I said, all the things that happened up to this point have only compounded the problems. Came a familiar voice of Detective Sakauchi from behind the door. Izuku held his breath as the doorknob began to turn.
The door's open. Rush out into the hall quickly.
Alp said sternly. Izuku nodded silently. The door slowly opened as the two men came to an abrupt stop.
What the hell happened to your office?
Asked a skeletal man that Izuku felt he recognized.
Someone's been in my office.
He rushed into his office, and as he did, Izuku and Alp rushed out the door, passing through the skeletal man. Izuku and Alp quickly made their way out to the street.
Do you know who could have been going through your office?
Toshinori asked. Sakauchi pointed to a small camera sitting in the corner of the room.
I don't know, but I will. And whoever it is seems to be just as interested in Izuku Midoriya as you are.
Sakauchi said, looking at an open file on his computer. A smiling, green-haired photo of Izuku Midoriya looked back at him.
Swear I won't forget this, why do I regret this? In my mind reckless, thoughts are feeling endless. Sitting up I'm breathless, anxiety's infectious. I feel so defenseless, betrayed and embarrassed. I hate being open, I hate being broken. I feel like an ocean filled up with emotion, anger.